The 10th Commandment. You shall not covet anything that belongs to others, not their spouse, their house, their servants, their animals, or any of their property. The key thing to recognise here is obviously that covetousness is a desiring, an envying which has grown to the proportion of being willing to act upon it and to take something from others by force, and ultimately to try and make it your own. And this is the sin which leads to the other sins, typically murder, adultery, theft, and then attempting to cover up the crimes through bearing false witness against the neighbour. So that's perjury and deceit in the courts. Now, of course, the broadness of this one is to attempt to get the person to regulate their thoughts, their desires, their emotions, and in some senses it's probably one of the hardest, even though it's right at the end, but purely because it's got that self-regulatory, self-reflective aspect which is important in order to be able to obey or to abide by the 10th Commandment. Now, when we consider the dialectical materialist conception of the world, we've already got baked into it that from the Marxist perspective, there is this new revelation by which the person comes to the knowledge that reality as they have understood it is a complete falsehood. They're trapped in a prison, but they have somehow come to the revelation and unique knowledge of this, whilst everyone else is in deceit, and they are morally obligated to march and forcibly take everyone else either into the same state of enlightened consciousness as themselves or to destroy them in that process if they are resistant. Now, of course, if all of reality is essentially positioned as an inversion, merely by asserting so, then all of the existing commandments, relationships, objects that people possess, these are all going to need to be likewise inverted. That's what we've been exploring. So here in the dialectical materialist iteration, we say that a false relationship with the material forces all to covet. History demands that you free humanity from covetousness by forging a higher order in which there is no private property, labour, fetishism, or sacrifice of life. At this point, all of these concepts should be fairly straightforward. We've explored them across the series on queer theory, Marxism, and environmentalism, and through the Ten Commandments. But as a quick recap, humanity is going to be that monadological, pantheist species being. And they are distinct from the proletariat, so that's a slight mistake that Lukács makes in History of Class Consciousness, is he accidentally locates the species being with the proletariat, although there is a certain level of truth in which becoming and become are united as one, and so there is that aspect he's recognised. Nonetheless, there's also the concepts of labour, fetishism, and their association with the sacrifice of life. So, of course, if you are not of the correct form of consciousness, you are partaking in the explicit sacrifice of others. Now, one of the key things to recognise is that this need not be true, and nowhere in Marx's literature is this just demonstrated. It's simply asserted and then associated with the rest of his system, and in the attempt to make the system as broad as possible, as all-encompassing as possible, he developed something which is self-contained, but it is indeed just that. It's self-contained. It's this hermetic system, and then it's got the Gnostic aspect as well, which is the false reality, relieving yourself from falsehood and coming into the true reality. So that's something that James Lindsay's quite thoroughly developed, and certainly my own conclusions are in alignment with his. That's a lot of what's being parsed out, whether it's in my own book or here. Now, that aside, if you step back and you look at the Marxist system, the dialectical materialists, everything is designed to inflame passions and ressentiment. And these new words, the new concepts which are used to reinterpret reality through this new lens of revelatory discovered knowledge, which places the person into a higher category and of moral, and including moral superiority versus other people, always includes devaluing other people, denigrating them, harming them, associating with them human with sacrifice, with if not explicitly partaking in some sort of system of evil, doing so out of ignorance. So there's also this kind of aspect of lowering people's standing morally and cognitively in relation to the person who is the Marxist. Now, you can look at the entire system of dialectical materialism from the opposite angle, which is that it simply lets covetous run completely wild. And this is what motivates the desire for communism, which is the application of force in order to take other people's property, which is then supposedly made moral by then divesting that property to the species as a whole, or rather to your in-group who are left over after the period of extermination and massacring the people who disagree with you is complete. So the important thing to recognize is that from the Marxist perspective, the bourgeoisie, the world as it is entirely subjugated to covetousness, and it's through that the sacrifice of other peoples takes place. And so total is this false reality and the covetousness and the sacrifice of others that charity is likewise subsumed into this system of deceit and power. This is why Marx states that charity has long been organized as entertainment. So if you were to give something out of charity to other people, it's actually for your, well, obviously it's, as far as Marx is saying, for your own amusement, but furthermore it is an act which props up the false interpretation of reality, props up the false practices, and everything associated therewith. Freire likewise builds on the same idea. He says that people are domesticated by charity. So the idea there is, unless they go through his dialectical union of Christianity into dialectical materialism, and it is that specific movement, then the person can either remain as a beast who treats each other as beasts, or they can become a human. Likewise, we get similar ideas of rejecting charity in Spivak, where, you know, in this paper that's cited, she decided to withhold the address of a remote Indian village which did not have access to a well, in order that capitalists would not then donate the tools to establish a well to the people of that town. So for her, it was maintaining the kind of correct consciousness, which is more important. But, you know, you can kind of see how there's an element of covetousness about this. It's trying, well, that would be an explicit means of denying other people charity. So that's to take something, to prevent them having property and to maintain it for yourself. Not so much direct property as in well components, but as in having power over people's consciousness. And that is far more profound, because if you've got some kind of regulation of consciousness, then that's the thing which governs, or is the thing which you use to fight against covetousness. So there's a subtle relationship here in the 10th, which I'm trying to parse out slightly. Now, of course, we understand that in the Marxist system, revolutionaries are to throw off the state of class antagonism, which they have defined is taking place within their system, and the use of violence is obviously necessary to do so. That violence is at the extreme and direct level. There's also the use of force in a more subtle sense, like the control over consciousness. Now, with the Gnostic aspect, you have reality as a deceit, so that makes much of the other commandments straight away more easily reasoned with as being inverted from what they ought to be, and to then breaking those moral rules. And of course, if the existing system is positioned as being completely totalizing over all of reality, then the implementation or breaking of laws 3 and 4, that becomes much easier. But ultimately, these are all nested on rejection of God, and ultimately in Marx's system of pantheism, which is what takes place after the anti-Christian stage. Okay, so the key thing here is that in order to make the sacrifice of others, the stealing of their goods, and all of these kind of things acceptable, is you first got to get people to believe that doing evil is actually the good, but you can only do that by you can only successfully implement your covetousness as a good if you're inverting the previous system as it was, by attributing to them covetousness so that you can actually do your covetousness. So this should be fairly straightforward, at least on a kind of from a psychological level. Okay, now the implications of this are that the Marxists will never hold the high ground morally. They can only ever take their worst conception of the other and to then parasitize it, turn it upside down and say, this is what we need to do. And indeed, you'll find that every part of their literature essentially follows that cadence. It's boring. You can read some of their most insightful philosophers and you can make a prediction on where they're going to go by just taking what is moral, what is right, what is established, and simply inverting it. And you know that sometimes the ways in which the argument develops, or the kind of disturbing aspects of the reasoning and how they're meted out and developed, that can be an interesting little journey to go on. But ultimately, the conclusions are fairly straightforward, and you can actually use that as a shorthand rule of thumb and probably get to where they're going, but without necessarily having to read huge screeds of their text, because if there's one thing that they're not graced with, it's brevity. Okay, so the coveting of the consciousness is the part that I'm now going to develop. So when the commandment says coveting, spouse, house, servants, and animals, these are, I completely recognize, all to do with physical property. So these are problems with greed, the worship of mammon, however you're going to describe it. But when it says anything that belongs to others, that's a expansive term. Anything is very broad. And it's that kind of subtle aspect that I'm going to try and explore now in the addendum, which I have been kind of alluding to. So within dialectical materialism, definitely within post-structuralism, you've got these principles of sophistry, and then there's a very specific concept that they have established within the system, which is that of reflection. Reflection is likewise another form of non-contradiction between two things. So two things, a dyad, which actually appears as one, as a monad. So this is humanity, nature, or species being as the monad, as the pantheist deity. Now, you can covet people's physical objects and things like this, but there's a degree in which even if you were to take from other people, as if you owned a slave, there's still the possibility that they might resist you, or that they might do something against you which challenges you. And so an even higher level of covetousness, I think, is to desire the independence of a person's thought, their ability to reason, their ability to make moral judgments. And this is why power is so important, I think, to the way that the leftists view society and morality. It's not seen as, okay, well, if you stay within this system, you can enjoy a civilization which, yes, although it still has to endure the suffering of being, which you cannot dispense with, you still have the protection of the moral system. There's things that can become ordered and that you can rely upon, and you can still have some positive aspects which you get to enjoy, even though ultimately all will die. There will be suffering in your lives, and so on and so on. Okay, so if you state that power is the only thing which is really being affected, which is certainly central to Foucault's interpretation, in which, okay, well, you've got power which is vertical, but then you have the social contract, the Rousseauist aspect, in which you have power which is horizontal, and then you've got the connections between all of the vertices and all of the horizontal aspects, and you've got this whole kind of web of power which is relational. And it's to disrupt the existing relations of power and to re-establish them in a different way, but of course which contradicts with the old system. So you've still got the dialectical materialist project there in Derrida and Foucault, but it's being realized by a very different means. Social contract is being opened up to opt out of things like morality, to opt out of knowledge, which you use in order to inform the decisions you make, perhaps on material or moral issues. This likewise extends to language. So you opt out of the lexicon and the linguistic system to essentially develop more emotive language, which is morally loaded in orientation towards a known goal, which, if it isn't the position of a dialectical materialist ideal future, it is certainly at least the negation of the present system, as they would describe it, of how reality is interpreted, morality, justice, education, so on and so forth, knowledge, yada, yada, yada. Anyway, opt out of everything in reality into a possible new reality, and it's therein that many of the parallels with Marx's original project, though reformed, are demonstrated. So we get this really from Marx straight himself when he describes the dialectical methodology which he was developing whilst reading people like Cleanthes, who was a Stoicist and one of the antecedents which led to and developed the monist, pantheist, Stoicist view of the world. And then you also have his reading of Hegel, which is the dialectical methodology, but with the telos, the purpose of history. So you've got these things all coming together, which Marx describes as it was actually intended to be a new logic. And the key thing here is that once it's in your mind, as in, okay, well, all of these concepts and methodologies are in place, but then there's a emotional law which is restricting you to the use of those, otherwise you cannot come to knowledge and truth, then you're excluding even the very form of reason which is associated with the old society, and then you're ensuring that what we would now understand as metacognition and then the way we think about things are restricted to this new form of logic, and the new form of logic in turn is itself being used to develop a system which is oriented towards a certain goal, which is the communism, socialism, and so on and so forth. So naturally, this will completely transform everyone's understanding of reality, knowledge, truth, morality, and moral rules, past, present, and future, vis-a-vis the historicism, and then in your individual and your collective identity, the relations between those, and how all of these feed towards realizing the goal of the revolution. So you're already starting to see here that there's, simply by taking a deliberately contrarian and antithetical position to every aspect of reality, some opposite has been developed, the anti-Christianity, the anti-reason, the anti-formal logic, and so on and so forth. And these are all being knitted together into this new system. But when you are consciously adopting it, when you're consciously aware of it, as Gramsci's criticism of Marxism really was that not enough people held the dialectical methodology and historicism and the concepts. They hadn't considered knowledge as being, of the old system, as being a barrier to the revolution. That's something that you see developed in Horkheimer and Adorno. So culture acts back on people's consciousness and prevents the revolution. Well, that's contradictory to Marx's original system of reflection of the material relations up into consciousness, and that providing you could just shift the material relations, you could shift the consciousness and then move history forward. So once you get to Gramsci and the Frankfurt School, so that's Marcuse, Horkheimer and Adorno, then you've got the action back. That thesis changes Marxism to neo-marxism, so that's the new phase, or cultural Marxism. And then you, of course, have the later iterations of which are natural consequences of that, of the post-structuralists. So, okay, you opt out of the system of language, the systems of knowledge, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that should be fairly straightforward. Now, in conjunction with this transformation of the form of reason, we can also see that there's a transformation of the concepts and the ideas with which the world is understood. So the purpose of this is to control people's sense of moral outrage. You create new little words, you create new rhetorical strategies, and so on and so forth. And all of these are like Marx's thesis on Feuerbach. I think it might be the fourth one, in which he says, you need to divide people into different groups. And in the dialectical methodology, you divide people into different groups in order to then smash them back in together, and then whatever's left over is the synthetic product. It's the what's the word? There's the annulment between the two, and then there's the supersession. So you move into this higher stage. So the example of that would be that the proletariat are there's a conceptual sphere or framework which is laid out for them. And then they're populated by people who come from the old society. They then set themselves up as the enemies of that society. They come into contact with the bourgeoisie. The two fight one another viciously to the death and destroy one another. But then in the process, a new collective is established. But because of the dialectical process, the thing is continual. So it's just continual chaos, revolution, and murder all the way down. Okay, so if you're going to use rhetorical strategies in order to lower people's moral status, in order to attribute covetousness to the others, hence your victimhood, hence throwing off the system through violent revolution and taking things from the people that you saw as victimizing you, or simply indulging in your ressentiment and your desire to just cause mayhem and destruction, well then propaganda and censorship are going to be very important, because like we see here, the two dictionaries are splitting out. The proletariat have a lexicon, the bourgeoisie have a normal lexicon which is attached to reality. So the proletariat, they need to develop the concepts and linguistic frameworks which are completely antithetical in their connection to reality as part of this process of breaking, as part of demoralizing. And you can see that most comprehensively in any of the post-structuralist tradition. And the methods can be simple, such as by collapsing the distinction between two concepts. So one example would be collapse the contradiction between male and female, and then populate it with whatever is your desire, or whatever allows you to affect your power, also in providing it negates the old society. So that's where you have many of our modern legislative issues being developed from, is explicitly from Foucault's philosophy and then that tradition. Okay, so propaganda and censorship are extremely important, because what you're trying to do is to mold the appearance of the world in relation to the new moral valuation that you've attributed to each of those objects in the world, and then to lead people towards conducting themselves in accordance with you, the propagandist and censor's desires. So this here is a coveting of people's ability to apprehend reality, to then make use of their reason, to make moral judgments, and then to act accordingly. And then this is completely in alignment with what's been said by either Marxists or by people who've defected from Marxism. So an example here from Bella Dodd is that social justice, the revolutionary morality, all of these are a form of Marxist conditioning to get you to buy into the system and to get you to work in a certain way. And she says that even more significant was the fact that I had made their hates my hates, for it is a fact true and terrible, that the party establishes such authority over its members that it can swing their emotions now for and now against the same person or issue. It claims such sovereignty, even over conscience, as to dictate when it shall hate. And a great example of that would be to talk about a part of the Second World War, which we often gloss over. The Second World War opened with the invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia. Now, prior to this, the Marxists and the National Socialists had been essentially fighting one another kind of to the death, at least in the political sense, in Germany. The Nazis had won and eventually ascended to victory. So throughout that entire period, the Marxists were also labeling themselves as anti-fascist. That's where anti-fascism came from. Of course, Italy was fascist under Giovanni Gentili's neo-Hegelian system, and Gramsci took learning from what the fascists were doing well, and then part of that would then later go on to form what the Frankfurt School were thinking about in relation to the Nazis, once the Frankfurt School members had fled to America, and then that had in turn influenced the development of critical theory. So those are much more the cultural theses. Nonetheless, one of the key things to remember is that once the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact took place, you had the Nazis and the Marxists on the same side. So they had to suspend their hatred because now they were friends and they had to team up to butcher all the Polish. But of course, as tyrants do, when Hitler betrayed Stalin and the Marxists, they were like, oh, okay, well, back, the hate is back on. So they were back to hating the Nazis and then fighting, and then obviously because the Soviets were on the side of the Allies against the Nazis and the Japanese and the Italians, this means that, in history they kind of get a bit of a seemingly a pass on it, but we should never forget that the Soviets also helped start World War II. That was a system of Marxism. Okay, anyway, hatred is controlled, like everything else. It's got to be totalizing, it's mapped out, it's instrumental. And one of the key things here is that malice and sadism that are really seen as manifesting themselves in Marxist systems, you can kind of understand that if you've got other people who have been extremely successful around you, and Nietzsche was kind of touching on this with Ressentiment and a really seething hatred of people who are successful around you, is that, you've got this kind of desire to tear them down. So power ultimately is the ability to manifest that, and power is the thing that leftists accuse all others of doing to them, including even the imposition of morality or having a moral standard, such as these, the imposition of a moral standard such as do not murder is itself cruel, because it would, it's an imposition. If I want to be free to murder people, then why shouldn't I? And then ultimately, if you have power, then you can take other people's consciousness, and by coveting other people's consciousness, by acting on this, by taking their ability to reason, to apprehend reality, to understand the truth, and to make moral decisions in accordance with these, then you're ultimately forcing people to adopt and to exist in your semantic and moral representation of the world around you, but doing so in a way that they can only come to the same conclusions as you. And of course, if they don't come to the same conclusions and act in accordance with your values, then you advocate publicly that they be destroyed. So this is really a negation of other people's individuality in order to grow and develop the self. And of course, the sadistic aspect, which I don't think should be discounted, is that you can have people who are inverted to the degree that to see others suffering on account of your power over them is itself a joy. So simply just to have power over other people and to see how it hurts them, that can be joyful, in addition to the actual taking of the objects, whether it's their independence, knowing that they're under you. And of course, there's also then in the Marxist system the victimhood to sadism aspect. So you attribute covetousness to the others. This allows you to be a victim. This then makes the application of cruelty and destructiveness to those people much more easily. And then lastly, of course, if you've got the inversion of reality, then it's also important to recognize, and you can kind of see this in the inversion of charity and trying to take people's morals and standards away from them so that they have to opt into the Marxist ones, that there's really an unskilled form of empathy which is taking place, and this is likewise associated with an unskilled form of altruism, which is better termed pathological altruism. It's altruism which hurts other people, it's altruism which hurts the self, it's altruism which perverts the moral system, and which at every level is doing things which hurt people rather than strengthen them. And I do mean that, if you're abusing them and you're not strengthening them to either take their own steps forward, is it really altruistic, or are you actually inhibiting that person's development? Now, of course, there's a final piece in the puzzle, which is around what's being attacked. Now, Aquinas states that atheism is the sin of pride. And there's that song in, I think, The Prince of Egypt, which was, look at your life through heaven's eyes. So you're trying to use this gauge against yourself, and it's like, do I measure up against it? If not, then move towards it. And so you've got this sacrifice of the worst aspect and the lower aspects of yourself in order to move towards that higher gauge and realize a better iteration of yourself. And then through working on yourself and developing a better iteration on yourself, you make the world a better place. Now, of course, here the covetousness is so complete in terms of the way that people use logic and then interface with reality, their ability to have reason-informed emotions or reason moderating their emotions, that you also have the complete thieving, essentially, of their spiritual life. And here you're rejecting using that external gauge, and you're coveting the moral power to determine whether someone's lined up to your socially determined system or not. So that's why the Rousseauian social contract aspect is quite important, because you've got an arbitrary social contract, you then arbitrarily reform between a group of people the definition of human nature, what's moral, then you force people to conform to that rather than the system. Of course, if you were secular, then you would state that, well, that's just the case of what happens in the religious systems. Okay, so the thing with dialectical materialism is you reject God's wisdom, God's law. So you don't fear the things that are enjoined by God, and you transgress God's law, you eat from the fruit of the tree, and you attempt to establish your own moral system. Of course, all of the things which God's moral system protects you from are then invited back into being and take place. So the new moral gauge, the social contract, that's what people set themselves again. And then I think one of the key ways in which that you can see that there's and this doesn't necessarily manifest itself as a covetousness of other people's consciousness. I think this is more of an internal problem with the person who's a dialectical materialist, but they are, in spite of all of the horrors of dialectical materialism, wherever it's been implemented cross-culturally, there's a deliberate unwillingness to understand why that's come about. Whether it's Lukács, Freire, whoever, many others, it's all attributed to the very people who are to be destroyed, why the revolution ended up destructive. And yet you look at the writings of Marx and Engels, as we've seen earlier, and murder is one of their moral injunctions. So, the duplicitousness or lack of thought here is quite revealing. And but that said, if you're really going hard into the consciously knowing that you're inverting the moral system, then ultimately you want to take the word of creation. That's why the neologisms are important. That's why the ability to redefine human nature, morals, what is right and wrong is important, because you can completely turn things up on their head. So for example, Marx's statement to reject gravity so as to walk on water, well, this is fundamentally to change the nature of reality through this enlightened knowledge through revolutionary practice. And you get this in is warned against in the Bible. So Nimrod and the Tower of Babel, that is essentially this story. So now the whole world had one language and a common form of speech. One language such as English, and English has become the international language. That means the ideas in the English language can now more easily permeate all aspects of the world. It also means that we can become one people, and we may be at risk of building a Tower of Babel. That is, of course, what the totalizing system of dialectical materialism wants. It covets every aspect of reality, everything which falls under species and being, everything which is in the monad, and to control and to consciously reform it. Okay, so all the people have one language and a common form of speech, so they're all oriented towards saying the same thing. They're oriented towards a certain goal. So let us build for ourselves a city with a tower that reaches the heavens, that we make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the earth. So to be scattered over the face of the earth, you're trying to have an orienting point which maintains unity between the whole. There's consciousness of being scattered over the face of the earth. That would probably have been the threat of God's judgment, But then the making a name for ourselves, well, the word is with God. God defines light, dark, the world, the waters, the earth, Adam and Eve. So he has the word, he names Adam and Eve, he names man. But here we can see under the Tower of Babel, the desire for the followers of Nimrod to make a name for ourselves, to self-name, to take the word of creation from God. And of course, if you're trying to build a tower, then you're trying to situate yourself closer to the heavens. So that is to collapse the contradiction or the distance between God and yourself. So very dialectical. But likewise, if you understand that the flood's coming afterwards, then a tower, if high enough, might potentially stay above the flood. So we can see all of these themes come together. Now, ultimately, you replace God with the third subject of the monistic species being, so you're coveting not only the earthly possessions of people, not only are you coveting the conception of reality and everything therein of other people, but you're also coveting the transcendent in as far as the Word of God. And of course, you can see this in the replacement of God as the moral gauge with the species being and its man-made morals as the new gauge. So you hear Spurkin say, Alexander Spurkin, we thus look at ourselves primarily through the eyes of society, whole history, the future. So at each stage in the transformation, the species being the revolutionaries look back and declare after all of the destruction and the new phase of creation, the new phase of generation, that it is good. And you go through that continuously. So it's the people who get to survive who get to look back and say, yeah, it was all worth it, it was good. And everybody gets to indulge in their murderous desires and orient the world towards this certain end. But they can always say, well, it's good, it's worth it. The ends justify the means. Now, of course, principally the third subject of the collective pantheist deity is best achieved by reflecting that end point, even though you are not historically at that point in time. And so what you're trying to do is using your revelatory experience to see into the future, to understand how that species being conducts itself, how the world would be ordered in such a fashion, the politics, the morals, the knowledge, the culture, what's deemed beautiful, the various forms of expression, relationships, pleasure, and so on and so forth, and to then imitate those in the present day. In order to do that, of course, because they're antithetical to the present day, you need the social contract aspect. You break out of present society and assert these new morals, and you hammer and destroy everyone who contradicts you. Okay, so the point is that you are currently mediated with that endpoint in history through various stages of proletarian revolution, and then you're working towards it. Things are more complicated if you are after the critical theory stage of dialectical materialism, because you're not necessarily positing a known end goal of communism with the following development of socialism. You could maybe say, okay, well, you've got to that point. It didn't realize the international revolution in the way that was desired, so now a new development needs to take place. Enter post-structuralism and so on and so forth of Derrida and Foucault. But it's harder to at that point state, okay, there's a defined end goal. I think the defined end goal is made more immediate because it's simply negation of the present. So post-structuralism is to move beyond the existing structure of reality, the existing structure of consciousness, of personal relationships, of collective relationships. And you see the complete rejection of truth, and because truth being in relation to reality, so the two are connected to one another. And then in the inverted world, you're trying to say that the relation between truth and reality, which you thought was there, was in fact false. So what you thought was true was false. Therefore, you need to use this false image as a reflection. That new reflection tells you where to start looking and where to start making your developments, and then to move society into the relationship of this new development with reality. And so you start distorting the relationship between true, what's valid, with reality, in order to basically come up with a new new one which has been developed by people who are academics, and then of course they can attempt to educate people into that system and thereby covet their moral decision making, their reason, and so on and so forth. Okay, so when you've got all of this being developed, you want to try and remove the mediating steps and get to union with that monist entity at the end of time. Of course, slightly different in the post-structuralist stage because it's more focused on negation of the present. My own view is that the only reason that there's not an end stage is because it's a cynical strategy to avoid having an end stage which can then be critiqued. It's more to do with destroying the present and complete chaos, and then laying the ground for later dialectical philosophers to come in and posit an end goal. You see that more among the environmentalists, where you say, where they critique postmodernism and say, well, you know, there wasn't an organizing logic or an end goal to the project. So now that postmodernism has basically wrought all the chaos that it can develop and manifest, now they need to have people organize around a new centralizing theme. And of course, the thing which steps into that is environmentalism. And of course, the key thing that people should be questioning themselves on is, what is the relation between environmentalism and pantheism? And the connection between the two is dialectical materialism. Anyway, I've gone on a bit of digression. So Bataille enjoins revolutionaries to establish the collective within their consciousness. The idea, this is related to the third subject at the end of history, and what you're trying to do is you're trying to embody that collective species aspect of that identity within your own consciousness. So you're trying to negate, in a sense, your own individuality and to become more collectivized. What that strictly looks like, you know, Bataille doesn't necessarily have to be clear on, but of course it's not going to be individualist, it's not going to be bourgeois. The thing which is important to note is that in this kind of society, there's still a mechanism of confession. Confession is in accordance with social justice. It needs to be to the anti-Christian collective or to the species being, if and when it's manifested. And then all justice ultimately flows from the revolutionary collective. That's true also in Derrida, who's very clear of grammatology that one of the aims of his linguistic system is to return people to the point where the chaos in the language is so immense, or this will be the consequence of his system, but the chaos in the language will be so immense that they eventually move back towards his idealized goal, which he states that is the Rousseauist collective coming up with the law, issuing law from their consciousness as they are assembled physically immediately in the world. So you dispense with written laws and you go for tribal law of the mob. Now, of course, mercy is there provided it serves the revolution, and we should all remember that fear is a powerful motivator. And Sartre finally kind of states the materialist theosis that takes place is that Marxism is history itself becoming conscious of itself. So it's the world, you in it, history, the movement of time, all of these things becoming conscious of themselves and recognizing themselves as the singular entity. So that's the monad. And of course, if you recognize that you are part of nature, part of being, united with it as one, then you are ultimately realizing yourself as the pantheist deity. So if we go back to the start of what we were talking about in the 10th Commandment, there's all of the material aspects which are coveted, and that is all integrated into the monad. You need to use force to overcome barriers to the monadological realization. Likewise, you're going to need to force people to all be on the same hymn sheet, pardon the pun, in terms of the monad as well, because it's going to need to have an unmediated consciousness. Is going to be self-reflecting without mediations, so everyone needs to be on the same page. And then ultimately it's the movement into divinity, so it's the coveting of anyone who has transcendent consciousness, and to then materialize it and ensure that everything is aligned under this new hierarchy. So I hope that explains everything reasonably well, and there will be more videos to come. So this is not the end. These are the works cited, and I hope you've enjoyed this video.